rich man laughed at the orphan and humiliated him for his ragged clothes. But when he found out who the boy really was, it was too late. Charles Worthington stepped out of his gleaming Rolls-Royce, his polished leather shoes touching the pavement with a soft tap. The bustling streets of New York City seemed to part before him, as if recognizing the importance of the man in the impeccably tailored suit. His salt and pepper hair was meticulously styled, and his steel gray eyes surveyed the world around him with a mixture of disdain and entitlement. As he strode towards his office building, the early morning sun glinted off the golden W pinned to his lapel, a subtle reminder of his family's legacy. Charles was the CEO of Worthington Enterprises, a multinational corporation that had been in his family for generations. He carried himself with the confidence of a man who had never known want or struggle. "Good morning, Mr. Worthington," chirped his assistant Sarah as he swept past her desk. She hurried to keep up with his long strides, tablet in hand. "Your 9 a.m. meeting with the board has been moved to 10 and—" Charles waved a dismissive hand, cutting her off. "Cancel it. I have more pressing matters to attend to." He didn't bother to explain further, leaving Sarah to scramble and rearrange his schedule. Inside his expansive corner office, Charles settled into his leather chair, gazing out at the city skyline. New York was his kingdom, and from this vantage point, he felt like its ruler. He allowed himself a small smile, satisfaction coursing through him at the thought of his latest business acquisition. A gentle knock on the door interrupted his reverie. "Come in," he called, his voice carrying the authority of a man used to being obeyed. George, his longtime friend and business partner, entered the room. Unlike Charles, George's suit was slightly rumpled, and his tie was askew. "Charles, my friend, I've got great news about the Thompson deal." Charles raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Oh? Do tell." As George launched into the details, Charles's mind wandered. He thought about the charity gala he was obligated to attend that evening. Such events were necessary evils in his world, opportunities to network and maintain his public image. But the thought of rubbing elbows with the city's do-gooders and listening to sob stories about the less fortunate made him inwardly cringe. "Charles, are you listening?" George's voice snapped him back to the present. "Of course," Charles lied smoothly. "The Thompson deal sounds excellent. Make it happen." George beamed, oblivious to his friend's disinterest. "Fantastic. I'll get right on it. Oh, and don't forget about the gala tonight. Your tux is ready at Bergdorf's." Charles nodded, already dreading the evening ahead. As George left, he turned back to the window, his thoughts drifting to his own childhood. He had never wanted for anything, raised in the lap of luxury. It was a stark contrast to the children he'd be expected to feign concern for at the gala. As the day wore on, Charles went through the motions of meetings and phone calls, his mind elsewhere. When evening fell, he found himself standing before a mirror in his penthouse, adjusting his bow tie. The man staring back at him exuded wealth and power, every inch the successful businessman. "Another evening of pretending to care," he muttered to his reflection. "Let's get this over with." The limousine ride to the gala was silent. Charles lost in thought. He couldn't help but feel a sense of superiority as he thought about the less fortunate. In his mind, their circumstances were entirely of their own making. After all, he had worked hard to maintain and grow his family's empire. Why couldn't they do the same? As the car pulled up to the red carpet, Charles plastered on his most charming smile. Camera flashes erupted as he stepped out, waving to the gathered press. This was a performance he had perfected over the years. The benevolent businessman, here to support a worthy cause. Little did Charles know that this night would mark the beginning of a journey that would challenge everything he thought he knew about himself and the world around him. As he walked into the glittering ballroom, he was blissfully unaware that his life was about to change forever. The gala was in full swing, the opulent ballroom filled with the city's elite in their finest attire. Charles moved through the crowd with practiced ease, shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries. His charm was on full display, but behind his polite smile, A sense of boredom and irritation simmered. As he reached for another flute of champagne, a commotion near the entrance caught his attention. Turning, he saw a small figure being ushered in by one of the event organizers. It was a boy, no more than 12 years old, dressed in clothes that were clearly secondhand and ill-fitting. The child's wide eyes darted around the room, a mix of awe and fear on his face. "What on earth?" Charles muttered, frowning at the unexpected sight. He made his way over to the organizer, a woman named Margaret, whom he recognized from previous events. "Margaret, dear," he said, his voice low and controlled. "What's the meaning of this? Surely you haven't started allowing just anyone to wander in off the streets?" Margaret turned to him, her expression a blend of excitement and nervousness. "Oh, Mr. Worthington, this is Oliver. He's one of the children from St. Jerome's orphanage. We thought it would be inspiring to have him speak about how the donations have helped." Charles's frown deepened as he looked at the boy. Oliver stood awkwardly, his hands fidgeting with the frayed hem of his jacket. Their eyes met, and Charles was struck by the intensity of the boy's gaze. There was something in those eyes that unsettled him, a wisdom beyond the child's years. "Surely you jest," Charles said, turning back to Margaret. "You can't expect someone in such state to address this gathering. It's unseemly." Oliver's face fell, his cheeks flushing with embarrassment. Margaret opened her mouth to respond, but Charles cut her off with a wave of his hand. No, this won't do at all. Perhaps a video presentation would be more appropriate. We wouldn't want to make our guests uncomfortable, would we?" As the words left his mouth, Charles felt a twinge of something unfamiliar. Was it guilt? He pushed the feeling aside, convincing himself that he was merely looking out for the boy's best interests. After all, wouldn't it be cruel to put him on display like some curiosity? Margaret's smile had faded, replaced by a look of disappointment. "Mr. Worthington, I assure you that Oliver is more than capable." "I said no," Charles interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. He turned on his heel, ready to walk away from the awkward situation. But Oliver's small voice stopped him in his tracks. "It's okay, Ms. Margaret. I understand." Charles looked back, surprised by the maturity in the boy's tone. Oliver met his gaze again, and this time, Charles couldn't look away. There was no anger in the child's eyes, only a profound sadness that seemed to pierce right through Charles' carefully constructed facade. For a moment, the noise of the gala faded away. Charles felt as if he were seeing himself through Oliver's eyes. A man of privilege, dismissing a child based solely on appearance. The realization was uncomfortable, and he quickly pushed it aside. "Well," Charles said, clearing his throat, "I'm sure you can find some other way to contribute, young man. Now, if you'll excuse me." As he walked away, Charles could feel Oliver's eyes on his back. He quickened his pace, eager to put distance between himself and the unsettling encounter. He needed another drink, something to wash away the strange feelings that had begun to stir within him. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of forced smiles and shallow conversations. Charles found himself unable to fully focus, his mind repeatedly drifting back to the boy with the old soul eyes. When it came time for his speech, he delivered it with his usual polish, but his heart wasn't in it. The words about generosity and compassion felt hollow on his tongue. As the gala wound down, Charles made his way to the exit, eager to escape. But fate had other plans. Just as he reached the door, he nearly collided with Oliver, who was being led out by Margaret. "Oh, Mr. Worthington," Margaret exclaimed. "I'm so glad we caught you. Oliver wanted to say goodbye." Charles froze, unsure of how to respond. Oliver looked up at him, a small, tentative smile on his face. "Thank you for having me, sir," the boy said softly. "I hope I didn't cause any trouble." In that moment, Charles felt a crack form in the armor he'd built around his heart. He opened his mouth, but for once, words failed him. Before he could formulate a response, Oliver and Margaret had disappeared into the night, leaving Charles standing alone, grappling with emotions he didn't fully understand. As he climbed into his waiting limousine, Charles couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had just occurred. Little did he know, this encounter was just the beginning of a journey that would challenge everything he thought he knew about himself and the world around him. The days following the gala passed in a blur for Charles. He threw himself into his work with renewed vigor, trying to shake off the unsettling feelings that had taken root since his encounter with Oliver. But despite his best efforts, the boy's face kept appearing in his mind, those old soul eyes haunting his thoughts. On a particularly dreary Tuesday morning, Charles sat in his office, staring out at the rain-soaked city. The usual satisfaction he felt when surveying his domain was noticeably absent. Instead, a strange restlessness had settled over him, an itch he couldn't quite scratch. A knock on the door interrupted his musings. "Come in," he called, grateful for the distraction. Sarah, his assistant, entered with a stack of papers. "Mr. Worthington, I have the quarterly reports you asked for. Also, there's a Mr. Blackwood here to see you. He doesn't have an appointment, but he insists it's urgent." Charles frowned. "Blackwood? I don't recall any Blackwood in our circles. What's this about?" Sarah shrugged apologetically. "He wouldn't say, sir, only that it's a matter of great importance." Curiosity piqued, Charles nodded. "Very well. Send him in." Moments later, a tall, distinguished man in his 60s entered the office. His silver hair was neatly combed, and his suit, while not as expensive as Charles's, was well-tailored. He carried a worn leather briefcase that seemed at odds with his polished appearance. "Mr. Worthington," the man said, extending his hand. "Thank you for seeing me on such short notice. I'm Edward Blackwood, of Blackwood and Associates." Charles shook his hand, studying the man closely. "And what can I do for you, Mr. Blackwood?" Blackwood's expression turned serious. "I'm here on a matter of utmost delicacy, Mr. Worthington. It concerns a young boy named Oliver Twist." At the mention of Oliver's name, Charles felt a jolt of surprise. "The orphan from the gala? What about him?" Blackwood sat down, placing his briefcase on his lap. "Mr. Worthington, what I'm about to tell you must remain in the strictest confidence. Young Oliver is not just any orphan. He is, in fact, the sole heir to one of the largest fortunes in the country." Charles's eyebrows shot up in disbelief. "That's preposterous. If that were true, why on earth would he be in an orphanage?" "For his own protection," Blackwood explained, his voice low. "Oliver's parents, the late Lord and Lady Brownlow, feared for his safety. There were those who would have gone to great lengths to eliminate the competition, so to speak. They placed him in hiding, entrusting only a select few with the truth of his identity." Charles leaned back in his chair, his mind reeling. The shabby clothes, the timid demeanor, it had all been a facade. "And you're telling me this because—" Blackwood's eyes met Charles's, his gaze steady. "Because, Mr. Worthington, you were seen interacting with Oliver at the gala. Your reputation precedes you, and we believe you might be in a unique position to help ease Oliver's transition into his new life." A mix of emotions swirled within Charles. Shock, disbelief, and something that felt uncomfortably like shame. He remembered his dismissive attitude towards the boy, the barely concealed disdain. If what Blackwood said was true, he had unknowingly insulted one of the wealthiest heirs in the country. I'm not sure I'm the right person for this," Charles stammered, uncharacteristically flustered. Blackwood leaned forward, his expression earnest. "Mr. Worthington, Oliver will need guidance in navigating the world of wealth and privilege. Who better to provide that than someone who has lived in that world his entire life?" Charles stood up abruptly, walking to the window. The rain had stopped, and weak sunlight was breaking through the clouds. He thought about Oliver, about the sadness in those eyes that had haunted him. Now, knowing the truth, that sadness took on a new meaning. "What exactly are you asking of me, Mr. Blackwood?" Charles asked, his back still to the room. "For now, discretion," Blackwood replied, "and perhaps, in the future, your mentorship. Oliver will be introduced to society soon, and he'll need allies. Charles turned back, his mind racing with the implications of what he'd just learned. The boy he had dismissed so callously was now poised to become one of the most influential figures in their circle. The irony was not lost on him. "I'll need time to think about this," Charles said finally. Blackwood nodded, standing up. "Of course, but please, Mr. Worthington, consider it carefully. This could be an opportunity for both you and Oliver." As Blackwood left, Charles sank back into his chair, feeling as though the ground had shifted beneath his feet. The world he thought he understood so well had just become a lot more complicated. And somewhere out there, a young boy named Oliver was about to have his life changed forever, just as Charles's had been in this very moment. The revelation about Oliver's true identity weighed heavily on Charles' mind in the days that followed. He found himself distracted during meetings, his thoughts drifting to the boy with the old soul eyes. The irony of his previous behavior wasn't lost on him, and a sense of unease had taken root in his usually confident demeanor. One crisp autumn afternoon, Charles decided to take a walk to clear his head. He found himself wandering through a part of the city he rarely visited, where the buildings were less polished and the streets less manicured. As he turned a corner, he came face to face with St. Jerome's orphanage, the very place Oliver had called home. Charles hesitated, then approached the worn brick building. He wasn't sure what compelled him to do so, but before he knew it, he was ringing the doorbell. A kind-faced woman in her 50s answered, her eyebrows rising in surprise at the sight of the well-dressed man on her doorstep. "Can I help you, sir?" she asked, her tone cautious but welcoming. Charles cleared his throat. "Yes, I'm here to inquire about one of your children." "Oliver Twist?" The woman's expression softened. "Ah, Oliver. He's such a dear boy. Are you here about the adoption process?" Charles blinked, caught off guard. "No, not exactly. I met Oliver at a charity event recently, and I was impressed by him. I wanted to learn more about his situation." The woman, who introduced herself as Mrs. Thompson, invited Charles inside. The interior of the orphanage was clean, but clearly in need of repairs. Children's artwork adorned the walls, bringing color to the otherwise drab hallways. As they walked, Mrs. Thompson spoke fondly of Oliver. "He's always been special, that one. Quiet, but with a heart of gold. The younger children adore him." They reached a small office, and Mrs. Thompson gestured for Charles to sit. "May I ask why you're so interested in Oliver, Mr. Worthington?" Charles supplied. "Charles Worthington. And to be honest, I'm not entirely sure myself." Mrs. Thompson's eyes widened with recognition. "Mr. Worthington? The businessman?" Charles nodded, feeling oddly uncomfortable under her gaze. "Well," Mrs. Thompson said, leaning back in her chair, "I must say, this is unexpected. Oliver mentioned meeting you at the gala. He was quite impressed by your speech." A pang of guilt shot through Charles. "He was?" Mrs. Thompson nodded. "Oh yes, he said you spoke about the importance of giving back to the community. It inspired him." Charles felt a lump form in his throat. He remembered that speech, words he had delivered without truly believing them, a performance for the benefit of his public image. And yet, they had touched this remarkable boy. "Mrs. Thompson," Charles said, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant, "I must confess something. My behavior towards Oliver at the gala was less than kind. I judged him based on his appearance, and I deeply regret it." Mrs. Thompson's expression remained neutral, but her eyes softened. "Mr. Worthington, the fact that you're here now admitting this speaks volumes. We all make mistakes. It's how we choose to rectify them that matters." Her words struck a chord in Charles. For the first time in years, he felt a genuine desire to make amends, to do better. Is there anything the orphanage needs?" Charles asked, surprising himself with the offer. Mrs. Thompson's eyes lit up. "Oh, there's always something. Our roof needs repairs and our library could use new books. But Mr. Worthington, while donations are always appreciated, What these children need most is time and attention. Charles nodded, an idea forming in his mind. Mrs. Thompson, would it be possible for me to volunteer here? Perhaps read to the children or help with homework? The surprise on Mrs. Thompson's face was evident. You'd want to do that? I would, Charles said, realizing as he spoke that he truly meant it. I have skills that could be useful. Financial literacy, for example. I could teach the older children about managing money. Mrs. Thompson's smile was warm. That would be wonderful, Mr. Worthington. I'm sure the children would benefit greatly from your expertise. As Charles left the orphanage, he felt lighter than he had in years. The city around him seemed different somehow, full of possibilities he had never noticed before. He knew that his journey was just beginning, that there would be challenges ahead as he navigated this new path. But for the first time in a long while, Charles Worthington was looking forward to the future. A future that, unexpectedly, included a group of orphans and one very special boy named Oliver Twist. In the weeks that followed, Charles found himself dividing his time between the corporate world he'd always known and the newfound purpose he'd discovered at St. Jerome's orphanage. Every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, he would leave his plush office, trading his executive chair for a spot on the worn carpet of the orphanage's makeshift classroom. On this particular Thursday, Charles stood before a group of eager faces, their eyes wide with curiosity. He had just finished explaining the basics of budgeting to the older children, using colorful charts and simple examples to make the concepts accessible. Remember, he said, his voice gentler than it had ever been in a boardroom, a budget is like a roadmap for your money. It helps you know where you're going and how to get there. A hand shot up, belonging to a freckle-faced girl named Lucy. Mr. Worthington, what if you don't have any money to budget? The question caught Charles off guard. It was a stark reminder of the reality these children faced, a reality he had been blind to for so long. He paused, choosing his words carefully. That's an excellent question, Lucy. Even when resources are limited, understanding how to manage them is crucial. It's about making the most of what you have, no matter how little it might seem. As he spoke, Charles's eyes drifted to the back of the room, where Oliver sat quietly. The boy had been a constant presence in these sessions, always attentive but rarely speaking up. Today, however, there was a thoughtful look in his eyes that made Charles curious. Oliver, he called out gently, you look like you have something to add. Would you like to share your thoughts? Oliver hesitated for a moment, then spoke softly. I was just thinking, sir, that maybe budgeting isn't just about money. Maybe it's about all our resources, like time and energy too. A smile spread across Charles' face, genuine pride warming his chest. That's a brilliant observation, Oliver. You're absolutely right. Managing our time and energy is just as important as managing our money. The rest of the class nodded in agreement, and Charles couldn't help but marvel at the wisdom coming from this young boy. Oliver's true identity was still a closely guarded secret, known only to Charles and a select few. Yet even without the trappings of wealth, Oliver's innate intelligence and compassion shone through. As the lesson wrapped up, Charles found himself lingering, helping the children pack up their materials. He noticed Oliver hanging back, seemingly waiting for a chance to speak privately. Mr. Worthington, Oliver said as the last of his classmates filed out, can I ask you something? Charles nodded, kneeling down to be at eye level with the boy. Of course, Oliver. What's on your mind? Oliver fidgeted with the hem of his worn sweater, a habit Charles had come to recognize as a sign of nervousness. Why are you doing this? Teaching us, I mean. You're so important and busy and we're just... Just what, Oliver? Charles prompted gently when the boy trailed off. Just orphans, Oliver finished, his voice barely above a whisper. The words hit Charles like a physical blow. He took a deep breath, fighting back the emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. Oliver, listen to me, he said, his voice firm but kind. There's no such thing as just an orphan. Every single one of you is important, valuable and deserving of knowledge and opportunities. Oliver's eyes widened, a mix of surprise and hope flickering across his face. Charles continued, "I'm here because I've realized that true wealth isn't just about money in the bank. It's about the richness of experiences, the wealth of knowledge, and the abundance of kindness we share with others. You and your friends here have taught me more about that in these few weeks than I've learned in all my years in business." A small smile tugged at Oliver's lips. "Really?" "Really," Charles affirmed. "And do you know something else, Oliver? I have a feeling that one day you're going to do great things. You have a remarkable mind and a kind heart. Those are far more valuable than any amount of money." As Oliver's smile widened, Charles felt a warmth in his chest that no business deal had ever provided. He realized that in trying to mentor these children, he was the one being transformed. Walking out of St. Jerome's that evening, Charles's mind was buzzing with ideas. He had resources, connections, influence, all things he had previously used solely for his own benefit. But now he saw the potential to use them for something more, something meaningful. The sun was setting as Charles made his way back to his office, casting long shadows across the city streets. But for Charles Worthington, it felt like a new dawn was just beginning. As autumn gave way to winter, Charles found himself increasingly invested in the lives of the children at St. Jerome's. His twice-weekly visits had become the highlight of his schedule, a fact that both surprised and delighted him. The corporate world that had once consumed his every waking moment now seemed less vibrant in comparison to the joy he found in teaching and mentoring. On a chilly December morning, Charles sat in his office, reviewing the latest financial reports. His mind, however, kept drifting to the upcoming holiday season and the children at the orphanage. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called, expecting his assistant Sarah. Instead, Edward Blackwood entered, his expression grave. "Mr. Worthington, we need to talk." Charles straightened in his chair, instantly alert. "Mr. Blackwood, what brings you here?" Blackwood settled into the chair across from Charles, his weathered hands clasping a thick folder. "It's about Oliver. The time has come to reveal his true identity to the world." A mix of emotions washed over Charles. Excitement for Oliver, concern for the challenges ahead, and a twinge of something that felt oddly like loss. "I see," he said carefully. "And how do you propose we proceed?" "We'll need to move quickly," Blackwood explained. "The press conference is scheduled for next week. Oliver will be introduced as the heir to the Brownlow fortune, and arrangements will be made for his transition from St. Jerome's to his family estate." Charles nodded, his mind racing. "And the other children at St. Jerome's, how will this affect them?" Blackwood raised an eyebrow, seemingly surprised by the question. "I wouldn't imagine it would affect them at all, Mr. Worthington. Our concern is Oliver's well-being and his integration into his new life." For a moment, Charles was taken aback. It was exactly the kind of response he himself would have given just a few months ago. Now, it felt woefully inadequate. "Mr. Blackwood," Charles began, leaning forward, "I've spent considerable time with Oliver and the other children at St. Jerome's. They're not just statistics or background characters in Oliver's story. They're his family." Blackwood's expression softened slightly. "I understand your concern, Mr. Worthington, but we must focus on Oliver's future. The inheritance, the responsibilities that come with it, these are monumental changes for a young boy." Charles stood up, pacing behind his desk. "Yes, and that's precisely why we need to consider the whole picture. Oliver's strength comes from the bonds he's formed at St. Jerome's. To simply pluck him out of that environment without consideration for his emotional well-being or the impact on the other children, it seems short-sighted." Blackwood watched Charles with growing interest. "You've become quite invested in this situation, haven't you, Mr. Worthington?" Charles paused, realizing the truth in Blackwood's words. "I suppose I have," he admitted. "These children, Oliver included, have shown me a perspective on life I'd been blind to for far too long." A moment of silence passed between the two men. Then Blackwood spoke, his tone thoughtful. "What would you suggest then?" Charles' mind whirred with possibilities. "We proceed with the announcement, but we do it on Oliver's terms. We involve St. Jerome's in the process. Perhaps we could set up a foundation in Oliver's name to support the orphanage and others like it. And most importantly, we give Oliver the choice of how and when he transitions to his new life." Blackwood nodded slowly, a hint of admiration in his eyes. "That's not at all what I expected from you, Mr. Worthington. But I must say it's a commendable approach. Oliver is fortunate to have you in his corner." As Blackwood left, promising to consider Charles' suggestions, Charles sank back into his chair. The magnitude of what lay ahead was daunting. Oliver's life was about to change dramatically, and Charles was determined to ensure that change was for the better. He picked up his phone, dialing a familiar number. "Sarah, clear my schedule for the rest of the day. I need to visit St. Jerome's. There's something important I need to discuss with Oliver and Mrs. Thompson." As he hung up, Charles gazed out at the city skyline. The world Oliver was about to enter was full of both opportunity and pitfalls. But with the right guidance and support, Charles believed the boy could navigate it while holding on to the compassion and wisdom that made him truly special. With renewed purpose, Charles gathered his coat and headed out. The journey ahead would be challenging, but for the first time in his life, Charles Worthington felt ready to face those challenges, not for personal gain, but for the betterment of others. And in that realization, he found a satisfaction deeper than any business success had ever provided. The day of the press conference arrived, bringing with it a flurry of activity and nervous energy. Charles stood in the wings of the small auditorium at St. Jerome's, watching as reporters and cameras filled the space. It had been his idea to hold the event here, a decision that had raised eyebrows among some of his colleagues, but one he knew was right for Oliver. Oliver himself stood nearby, fidgeting with the collar of his new suit. The boy looked both excited and terrified, his eyes darting between Charles and Mrs. Thompson, who offered reassuring smiles. "Remember," Charles said softly, kneeling down to Oliver's level, "you don't have to say anything you're not comfortable with. This is your story, and you get to decide how to tell it." Oliver nodded, taking a deep breath. "I'm ready," he said, his voice small but determined. As they stepped onto the makeshift stage, a hush fell over the crowd. Charles approached the podium first, clearing his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming," he began, his voice steady. "We're here today to share an extraordinary story, one of lost heritage, unexpected kindness, and the true meaning of family." He gestured for Oliver to join him, and the boy stepped forward, his chin held high despite his obvious nervousness. "This is Oliver Twist," Charles continued. "Many of you may recognize him as one of the children from St. Jerome's orphanage. What you don't know is that Oliver is also the sole heir to the Brownlow fortune, one of the largest in the country." A collective gasp rippled through the audience, followed by a burst of excited chatter. Cameras flashed, capturing Oliver's wide-eyed expression. Charles raised a hand, quieting the crowd. Oliver's story is one of both loss and hope. Hidden away as an infant to protect him from those who might exploit his inheritance, he found a home and a family here at St. Jerome's. Now, as he prepares to step into his birthright, Oliver has made it clear that he wishes to use his newfound resources to help others in similar situations. At this, Oliver stepped up to the microphone. His voice wavered slightly as he began to speak, but grew stronger with each word. "I may have been born a Brownlow," he said, "but I grew up as Oliver Twist. The children and staff at St. Jerome's are my family. I don't want to leave them behind as I move forward. Instead, I want to use this opportunity to help make their lives better, and the lives of other orphans like us." Pride swelled in Charles's chest as he listened to Oliver's words. The boy's compassion and maturity continued to amaze him. "To that end," Charles added, "we're announcing the creation of the Brownlow Twist Foundation, dedicated to supporting orphanages and foster care programs across the country. Oliver will play an active role in guiding the foundation's efforts, ensuring that the needs of children like himself are met. The announcement was met with applause, and Charles could see tears in Mrs. Thompson's eyes as she watched from the side of the stage. As the press conference continued, Oliver fielded questions with a poise that belied his years. He spoke of his hopes for the future, his gratitude to St. Jerome's, and his determination to make a difference. When asked about his relationship with Charles Worthington, Oliver's face lit up. "Mr. Worthington has been a great teacher and friend," he said. "He's shown me that wealth isn't just about money, it's about what you do with the opportunities you're given." Charles felt a lump form in his throat at Oliver's words. He thought back to their first encounter at the gala, marveling at how far they'd both come since then. As the event wound down, Charles watched Oliver surrounded by his friends from St. Jerome's, all of them buzzing with excitement about the foundation and the changes to come. It was a far cry from the lonely, intimidating transition he had initially envisioned for the boy. Later, as the last of the reporters filed out, Charles found himself alone with Oliver in the quiet auditorium. "You did wonderfully," Charles said, placing a hand on Oliver's shoulder. "How are you feeling?" Oliver looked up at him, a mix of emotions playing across his face. "Overwhelmed," he admitted, "but also hopeful." "Do you really think we can make a difference, Mr. Worthington?" Charles nodded, his voice filled with conviction. "I know we can, Oliver. And do you know why? Because you've already made a difference. You've changed me, and I'm certain you'll change many more lives as we move forward." As they walked out together, Charles realized that this was just the beginning of a new chapter, not just for Oliver, but for himself as well. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in his life, Charles Worthington was excited about the journey, not just the destination. The weeks following the press conference were a whirlwind of activity. Oliver's story had captured the public's imagination, and the media buzz showed no signs of dying down. Charles found himself juggling his corporate responsibilities with his new role as Oliver's mentor and advisor, all while helping to set up the Brownlow Twist Foundation. On a crisp Saturday morning, Charles arrived at St. Jerome's to find Oliver sitting on the front steps, a pensive look on his young face. The boy had opted to remain at the orphanage during this transition period, a decision Charles wholeheartedly supported. "Good morning, Oliver," Charles greeted, settling down beside him. "You're up early. Everything all right?" Oliver nodded, his eyes fixed on the street before them. "Just thinking, Mr. Worthington, about everything that's happened and what's going to happen next." Charles studied the boy's profile, noting the furrow in his brow. "It's a lot to process, isn't it? Want to talk about it?" Oliver was quiet for a moment before speaking. "I visited the Brownlow estate yesterday," he said softly. "It's so big and grand. Nothing like here." He gestured at the modest building behind them. "I should be excited, shouldn't I? But I just felt out of place." Charles felt a pang in his chest, remembering his own feelings of isolation despite his privileged upbringing. "It's perfectly normal to feel that way, Oliver. Change, even good change, can be overwhelming." "What if I can't do it?" Oliver blurted out, his voice trembling slightly. "What if I'm not cut out for this new life? What if I let everyone down?" Charles turned to face Oliver fully, his expression serious but kind. "Oliver, listen to me. You are not alone in this. Yes, there will be challenges ahead, but you have a strength inside you that's truly remarkable. And you have people who care about you, who will support you every step of the way." Oliver's eyes met Charles's, a glimmer of hope shining through his worry. "You really think so?" "I know so," Charles affirmed. "And do you know why? Because in the short time I've known you, you've already made a profound impact, not just on me, but on everyone around you. Your compassion, your wisdom, those are qualities that will serve you well no matter where life takes you." A small smile tugged at Oliver's lips. "Even in a big fancy mansion?" Charles chuckled. especially in a big fancy mansion. In fact, I have an idea. Why don't we work on making the Brownlow estate feel more like home? We could invite your friends from St. Jerome's for a day out. Maybe even set up a space there for the foundation's work. Oliver's eyes lit up at the suggestion. Could we really do that? Absolutely, Charles nodded. It's your home now, Oliver. You get to decide what that means. As they continued to chat, Charles found himself marveling at the journey they'd both undertaken. He thought back to the arrogant businessman he'd been just months ago, so quick to judge based on appearances. Now, here he was, finding more fulfillment in mentoring this remarkable young boy than he'd ever found in boardrooms or business deals. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Thompson, who poked her head out the front door. Oliver, Charles, breakfast is ready, and Oliver, some of the younger children were hoping you might read to them after. Oliver jumped up, his earlier worries seemingly forgotten. Coming, Mrs. Thompson, he turned to Charles. Will you stay for breakfast, Mr. Worthington? Charles smiled, standing up and brushing off his trousers. I'd be delighted. As they walked into the orphanage, the sounds of children's laughter echoing through the halls, Charles felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the morning sun. He realized that in trying to guide Oliver through this transition, he too was undergoing a transformation. The day stretched before them, filled with simple pleasures, shared meals, story time with the younger children, and plans for the future. Charles found himself fully present in each moment, savoring the joy and connection he'd been missing for so long. As evening approached and Charles prepared to leave, Oliver caught him by the sleeve. Mr. Worthington, thank you for everything. Charles knelt down, meeting Oliver's gaze. No, Oliver, thank you. You've shown me what truly matters in life, and I promise you, we're going to do great things together. As he drove home that evening, Charles felt a sense of purpose and contentment he'd never known before. The road ahead might be uncertain, but with Oliver by his side, he was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead and to make a real difference in the world. As winter melted into spring, the Brownlow Twist Foundation began to take shape, its impact rippling through communities across the city. Charles and Oliver had thrown themselves into the work, their partnership growing stronger with each passing day. On a sunny afternoon, they stood together in the newly renovated East Wing of the Brownlow estate, now transformed into the Foundation's headquarters. The room buzzed with activity as volunteers and staff members worked on various projects. I can hardly believe it, Oliver said, his eyes wide as he took in the scene. Just a few months ago, this place felt so empty and intimidating. Now look at it. Charles nodded, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. It's remarkable what can happen when you have a vision and the determination to see it through. Their conversation was interrupted by Sarah, Charles' assistant, who had taken on a key role in the foundation. Mr. Worthington, Oliver, the group from St. Jerome's has arrived for the tour. Oliver's face lit up. They're here already? Come on, Mr. Worthington, let's go greet them. As they made their way to the front of the estate, Charles couldn't help but marvel at the change in Oliver. The timid boy he'd first met at the gala had blossomed into a confident young man, eager to share his good fortune with others. Mrs. Thompson led a group of wide-eyed children up the grand driveway, their excited chatter filling the air. Oliver rushed forward to greet them, high-fiving the younger kids and exchanging hugs with his old friends. Welcome to Brownlow House, Oliver announced, his voice carrying a hint of the public speaking skills he'd been honing. But more importantly, welcome to the home of the Brownlow Twist Foundation. We have so much to show you. As Oliver led the group on a tour, Charles hung back, watching with a mixture of pride and amazement. He listened as Oliver explained the Foundation's various initiatives, from educational programs to health services for underprivileged children. And this, Oliver said, leading them into a cozy library, is my favorite room. We're collecting books for orphanages and schools all over the city. Anyone want to help sort some donations? The children eagerly volunteered, and soon the room was filled with the sound of rustling pages and excited discussions about favorite stories. Later, as the tour wound down, Charles overheard a conversation between Oliver and his friend Lucy, the freckle-faced girl from St. Jerome's. "This is all so amazing, Oliver," Lucy said, her voice tinged with a hint of sadness. "But don't you miss us? Don't you miss St. Jerome's?" Oliver's response was immediate and heartfelt. "Of course I do, Lucy. St. Jerome's will always be my first real home. But now I have the chance to help make life better for kids like us. And the best part is, I can share it with all of you." Charles felt a lump form in his throat, touched by Oliver's words. He thought back to the man he'd been before meeting Oliver, focused solely on his own success, blind to the struggles of others. The transformation he'd undergone still amazed him. As the day drew to a close and the St. Jerome's group prepared to leave, Charles approached Mrs. Thompson. "I hope you and the children enjoyed the visit," he said. Mrs. Thompson's eyes were misty as she replied, "Mr. Worthington, what you and Oliver have accomplished here, it's beyond anything we could have imagined. You've given these children hope, shown them what's possible." Charles shook his head, a small smile playing on his lips. "No, Mrs. Thompson, Oliver has done that. I'm just fortunate enough to be along for the ride." As the bus pulled away, Oliver came to stand beside Charles. "Mr. Worthington," he said, his voice thoughtful, "do you think we're making a difference? Really making a difference?" Charles looked down at the boy who had changed his life in so many ways. "Oliver," he said, placing a hand on his shoulder, "I know we are. And we're just getting started." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the sun begin to set over the sprawling grounds of the estate. Charles felt a sense of contentment wash over him, deeper and more meaningful than any he'd experienced in his years of corporate success. "Come on," he said finally. "We've got a big day tomorrow. The new after-school program launches, remember?" Oliver nodded eagerly, already moving towards the house. "Race you to the study," he called over his shoulder, breaking into a run. Charles laughed, a full, hearty sound that echoed across the grounds. As he jogged after Oliver, he realized that for the first time in his life, he was truly looking forward to tomorrow, and all the tomorrows that would follow. As summer bloomed in full force, the Brownlow Twist Foundation celebrated its first anniversary. The grand ballroom of the Brownlow estate, once a symbol of isolated wealth, now buzzed with the energy of hundreds of guests, children from St. Jerome's and other orphanages, volunteers, donors, and community leaders. Charles stood at the podium, surveying the crowd with a sense of wonder. Just over a year ago, he would have seen such an event as a mere obligation, a necessary evil for maintaining his public image. Now he felt genuinely moved by the sea of faces before him, each representing a life touched by the Foundation's work. "Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls," he began, his voice warm and sincere. "Thank you all for being here today. A year ago, I stood before a very different crowd, announcing the existence of this foundation. I thought I understood what we were setting out to do. I couldn't have been more wrong." A ripple of curious murmurs passed through the audience. "I thought we were going to change lives," Charles continued. "And we have. But what I didn't realize was how profoundly my own life would be transformed in the process." His eyes found Oliver in the front row, the boy beaming up at him. Charles smiled back before addressing the crowd again. "None of this would have been possible without the remarkable young man who inspired it all. Oliver, would you join me up here?" As Oliver made his way to the stage, the room erupted in applause. Charles felt a surge of pride as he watched the boy he'd once dismissed climb the steps with confidence and poise. "Oliver," Charles said, turning to face him, "a year ago, I thought I was meant to be your mentor. I couldn't have been more wrong. You've taught me more about compassion, resilience, and the true meaning of success than I ever could have imagined. You've not only changed my life, but the lives of countless others through your vision for this foundation." Oliver's eyes glistened with unshed tears as he took the microphone. "Thank you, Mr. Worthington. but I couldn't have done any of this without you. You saw potential in me when others might have looked away. You've shown me that it's not where you come from that matters, but what you do with the opportunities you're given." As Oliver continued to speak, detailing the Foundation's achievements and future plans, Charles found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment. He thought of their first encounter at the gala, of the arrogant man he'd been, and the compassionate leader he was becoming. The celebration continued late into the evening. Charles watched as Oliver moved through the crowd, chatting easily with donors and playing games with the younger children. He saw Mrs. Thompson from St. Jerome's, beaming with pride as she spoke to a group of potential foster parents. Even Sarah, his once rigid assistant, was laughing as she danced with some of the kids. As the night wound down, Charles found himself on the terrace, taking a moment of quiet reflection. Oliver joined him, leaning against the railing and gazing out at the twinkling city lights. "Penny for your thoughts, Mr. Worthington?" Oliver asked, a hint of teasing in his voice. Charles chuckled. "I was just thinking about how much has changed. How much I've changed, thanks to you." Oliver shook his head. "We changed each other, I think. And we're going to keep changing things, aren't we? There's still so much to do." "Indeed there is," Charles agreed. "But tonight, let's just enjoy how far we've come." As they stood there, the sounds of laughter and music drifting from inside, Charles felt a profound sense of peace. He had spent most of his life chasing success, thinking it would bring him happiness. Now he understood that true fulfillment came from making a difference in the lives of others. The boy who had once been a nameless orphan, and the man who had once been blinded by his own privilege, now stood side by side, united in their mission to create a better world. As they turned to rejoin the party, Charles knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. In that moment, surrounded by the joy and hope they had helped create, Charles Worthington and Oliver Twist were no longer defined by their past or their circumstances. They were simply two people who had found their true purpose, ready to write the next chapter of their extraordinary journey. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel. Now, how about another one? To watch another nice story, just click on the video appearing on your screen.